All right, our next guest here is going to be the CTO of Signal, Ehren Kret.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Alrighty, so I was going to go through a bit of a talk here on how the Signal protocol works. And so it's kind of an interesting topic for kind of technical audience. So yeah, we'll get started. All right. Kind of going through the talk here, kind of the overview. We're going to have sort of the building blocks of the protocol itself. We'll talk about Diffie-Hellman, key derivation functions, and so on. Then kind of the properties of an encryption protocol that we'd be looking for. So maybe the two you've heard about in Signal are forward secrecy and future secrecy, or easier to understand, post-compromise security. And then it's often kind of called the double ratchet protocol. We'll go through the two different types of ratchets that it has, why they're both there, how they work, and finally at the end go through some examples where we put everything together. All right, so Diffie-Hellman, you may have heard of before. Here's kind of a graphical explanation of how this works. You effectively have some common base material that is public, that everyone's agreed upon. Each person picks some random number, mixes it together in a way that is hard to reverse, and then shares those two elements across a public exchange where anyone could potentially intercept and read them. And from that, mix in their own secret ingredient as well and come up with a shared secret between the two people that is not known to anyone who is intercepting the material in between. So you can kind of see that worked through with paint here, where both people kind of take the same paint, mix it in, exchange the mixed paint, and then add their own color and get to the same value at the end. That's kind of what Diffie-Hellman does. Within Signal, we use the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, but it works very much similar to the prime number-based Diffie-Hellman that you may have heard of as well. And then we use a key derivation function within Signal at least. Oh, we're skipped a few slides here. Yep, so it's effectively a cryptographic hash function. You'll take some bytes in, transform them in a one-way manner to some other values. You can use this to both strengthen some password with some degree of salting, or you can take a random value and stretch it. So if you have 32 random bytes, you could say take those 32 random bytes and produce some longer value that you can use in a way where everything is derived from the same value, but you can use each of those values separately, and we'll get into how that's useful in a moment. So Signal in particular, we use an HMAC-based key derivation function. This is a pretty simple little algorithm that uses HMAC SHA-256 as the baseline function. And you can produce any amount of requested length out of that up to about 8 kilobytes. So the function is simple enough. You can actually put the whole thing on one slide. If you assume you have an HMAC function, you can actually generate any amount of the 8 kilobytes that you want, given several of these inputs. The inputs to this function are effectively some secret key material, some info string, and the info string is just like a constant. In the Signal protocol, you'll find it say things like whisper text or whisper info. It's just a constant that's baked into the program so that different people using HKDF for different things will have effectively a different function. And then L is just the length of output you want. So pretty straightforward little function. So from there, we produce what we call KDF chains. And this is essentially a way to string together a key derivation function multiple times to get some output key that is unique every single time, but replicable. So if you start out with a given secret at the top, a KDF key, and you mix in some input, you can get another KDF key and an output key, and you can just repeat this essentially forever. So let's talk about kind of the properties that we want in an encryption algorithm. Forward secrecy is effectively that if you were to take someone's phone and break into it right now, and you'd been monitoring their communications with another party over a long period of time and had written down all the ciphertext. If you break into their phone right now, you shouldn't be able to go back and decrypt that ciphertext that you've written down. And so what we do in order to make that possible is we use distinct keys for every single message that are sent, And after you receive the message and decrypt it, we delete the key. So the key material is not on your phone anymore. Once you delete the message, there's nothing available on your phone to go back and see what that message was or to know how to decrypt it from the ciphertext that maybe someone had written down in between. So that's one part of the ratcheting here. And the other one, if you want post-compromise security, meaning that, okay, someone breaks into your phone right now, how do you make sure they can't read your messages out into the future forever? You need to mix new entropy into the key material on a regular basis. And the way that we do that in the Signal protocol is through the Diffie-Hellman ratchet. So between those two, you get two different ratchets, and that's how it's often referred to as a double ratchet protocol. So symmetric key ratchet, it's pretty straightforward. We've already discussed KDF chains, and essentially it's a special form of a KDF chain where there is a constant input that is used for every KDF step. And we start with a chain key at the top, and out of that, the output key that you'll see at each step along the way is an individual message. So every time you send a message, it's encrypted with another one of these messages off of a KDF chain, and we just step that forward every time you send a message or receive a message. And the reason it's called a symmetric key ratchet, both parties have the same chain key at the top, can do exactly the same function, so two people talking to each other have exactly the same chain. Now the Diffie-Hellman ratchet itself is a little bit more complicated. So at the top we'll have what we call a root key, and we're using our same KDF function again here, but instead of a constant input like we had for the symmetric ratchet, we're actually doing a Diffie-Hellman agreement. And there are two different Diffie-Hellman agreements taking place if you look at the slide here. So effectively what you've got is you've got a private key for yourself and another private key for yourself, so you have two different private keys there. And you've received a public key from the other party. The other person you're talking to has sent you a message that has a public key on the front of it. And what you're going to do is take that public key and mix it with the private key that you've previously sent them the public key part of. And using that input, you're able to derive the top of the chain key for the receiving chain. So all the messages that they send you are going to be derived off this chain. And now this new key that you've just created here is going to have another Diffie-Hellman agreement, and we do another KDF derivation on that to get the root of the sending chain. So that is going to be the next time you send them a message, you're going to send them this public key at the bottom together with messages encrypted using the message keys off the top of that chain. So each one of those chains is effectively representing something that starts here at the top with a chain key and derives new message keys every time. Alrighty. And so here's an example of Alice establishing a session with Bob. You know, it wouldn't be a talk about encryption without having Alice and Bob. So we've got Alice is initiating a message sending event over to Bob. And the first step that you need to sort of bootstrap here is actually where the server is involved. So you need to get a public key from Bob to start the message sending process. And that's where Alice will go to the server and say, I want to talk to Bob. Give me one of Bob's public keys. And so you'll get that as Alice. You'll do a Diffie-Hellman agreement. You'll create a sending chain. And you'll start sending messages over to Bob, who will use the receiving chain and the public key that you're sending to set up the sending chain. So when Bob wants to reply, that's how they'll reply to you. In the meantime, all the messages that Alice is sending will be received on this receiving chain on Bob's side. And then here's more filled out where Bob replies, and now you have a fully established session. So you've effectively got an example here of the Diffie-Hellman ratchet you can see taking place on the outsides where there's a private key and a public key pair being generated every other step. So every time someone switches, the conversation switches directions, if you will, you've got a new private key being generated. And then you have these chains in the middle that are sort of equated to one another because both parties are generating the same material on each chain. So you've got these symmetric key chains in the middle. One party uses for sending, the other party uses for receiving. You step them through, and it's an AES, standard AES encryption on the message. So you use the message keys you generate off that chain to decrypt each message. So we'll go through a worked example here. So we've got Alice initializing a session by fetching Bob's pre-key, and we started out with this root key. The root key is now, once you go through the KDF once, it's and can be deleted. And then you're going to have the sending chain key is generated, the symmetric key ratchet runs, you've got A1, that's the the key you use to encrypt the first message that Alice sends to Bob. Now, when Bob starts replying, you've got message B1, uses message key B1. You've got a Diffie-Hellman ratchet step takes place over here, where Bob has sent B1, this is in the green, this is Bob's public key. And all these gray boxes represent the KDF functions we talked about earlier. And you can see the derivation of the root key that happens, the chain key that's now used by Alice for receiving Bob's messages, and Alice generates a new chain key as well. That's going to be used the next time Alice responds. And then we can see a worked example here of Bob has sent B2, and then Alice responds A2, A3, A4. Those are 3 messages from Alice to Bob. And this is sort of what the structure of the state looks like. And it will continue iterating forward like this indefinitely as Alice and Bob exchange messages. So it's a lot of a state. There's a little bit of tricky situations it can get into. If you get messages out of order, how do you deal with that? So if you would get a message out of order, so if, say, you get Bob's message B4 received before 2 and 3, then you've got a problem. You want to delete the old keys, but you are deriving the old keys from material that you need to throw away in order to not hold on to B4. So what the protocol does is pretty simply, it derives them all, saves these message keys, because you can't use B2 or B3 to derive B4. So ultimately, it will throw away the intermediate chain keys, save B2, save B3, put them away in the hopes that someday some message will come in, number 2, number 3, and it will be able to decrypt that message using those keys. And then it can only contain the information needed to derive things beyond B4, but not B4 itself. So within the signal library, there's a little bit of trade-off made here about how many of those to retain. We'll only retain about 10,000 of those keys at most, so it's actually possible to end up with like events where messages are not decryptable because someone has sent a lot of messages that got dropped or something like that. But because we're retaining each of these individual messages, you don't want to hold on to them forever. There's a lot of storage that would consume. So yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of the Signal protocol, and happy to take any questions. Yeah, so within groups, the way groups work is effectively half of this system. So groups themselves are effectively, each one of the senders has one of these chains. Let me see here. One of the symmetric chains, yes. Each one of the senders has a symmetric chain, and they effectively bootstrap it by sending to the group their sender key at the first time they want to send to the group. And then whenever someone leaves the group, we will change that chain key so that no one who had the old one will be able to decrypt any new messages. And also on a like regular basis, based on time or number of messages, we'll throw away the sender key as well. So effectively, groups use just the symmetric ratchet with some rules and heuristics for when to change the symmetric ratchet to a new key. No ETA quite yet. The main trickiness with that is it's not moving just directly to like an alternative identity system. It's trying to move to a model where you still have one conceptual identity to make the user experience easy, but allow looking it up to stay unlinked unless you allow the other person to link them together. And that's a little bit hard to do in like a privacy-preserving way. So that's sort of where the challenge lies there. We're trying to sort of work that out with like if someone has accepted a message request from you that allows you to like know that this username and phone number are the same person. But doing that in a way that's not too easily linkable is a bit of a challenge. Yes, I think the question is essentially how do you get post-compromise security in a group? It's a great question, and that's part of the reason why we have those heuristics for like when to rotate the chain key regularly. So if someone leaves the group, we'll rotate it immediately. Otherwise, there's some maximum length of time that you can continue to use the same chain key, and some maximum number of messages, if I recall correctly. So that way we have some regular rotation of that one. Yeah, in a DM, it's every message uses the symmetric ratchet, and every time the other party replies, you will switch, you'll do the DH ratchet step. So that one occurs quite often. In the group, it's a little bit less often. Yeah, so when you start a conversation, you have to go to the server and say you're looking for the pre-key, effectively that first public key that you're fetching in this session initiation step. So the server knows that someone is trying to start a session with Bob. We don't require that you authenticate to us in order to do that, because there's no need for us to know who's trying to start the session. So you can do that, just some random TCP connection comes in and says, I want one of Bob's public keys. So that was part of your question. What was the second part of your question? Yeah, so messages will pass through us, but on an ongoing basis, we have an unidentified delivery channel. So we allow people to anonymously come to the server and say, I have a message for this party. And there is effectively a password system there that part of this initial exchange within the message itself also provides, like Alice and Bob will effectively exchange passwords for like how to deliver a message to them without identifying who you are. So you can prove to the server, I've talked to Alice before, Alice says I can send messages to Alice, but I'm not going to tell you who I am. And that allows us to, when you're first establishing a session with somebody, we can do spam prevention, because we don't want to just allow everyone to send you a message without knowing who the sender is, because we need to stop people who are trying to commercially spam other users. But once you have an ongoing session, we don't know who the sender is. We see messages are going to these users, but no one's telling us who they're from. Yes, they do. Most of them are one-time use pre-keys. There's a fallback in the event that they all run out. If you have to use that fallback pre-key, the initial security properties aren't as good because that fallback pre-key you can't just like delete as soon as you use it. So we try to avoid running out, but the client will periodically re-upload additional keys. It'll ask the server if there's any left and then re-upload some new ones. I don't know the number off the top of my head. It's pretty rare because the clients check pretty frequently. And if I remember correctly, in our current client, they upload like 100 at a time. And it's usually like when they get down below, I think about a quarter of them left, they'll upload new ones. So you'd have to have like 25 people try to start a conversation with you within the last day. I think it's like every day, but I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but you could see them in our source code. It's a fair bit, actually. I mean, we have a fairly small team, and we pretty much have about two people full-time looking at the spam problem, because unfortunately it is, there's enough people using the product where there's like a substantial incentive to like blast out messages to them. Luckily, like they tend to stand out. I mean, we can't see the message content, but because we have a registration system, we have to have phone numbers. Phone numbers are usually somewhat expensive to acquire, and we can see like, oh, this person is like starting 100, 200 conversations immediately after registering with like people that they've never talked to before, and so they tend to like not look like normal users of the Signal app, and so that's usually how we find them. But there are some people who work hard to blend in. And those are certainly harder to track down. We have some reporting within the application to like let people send back to us that this number is spamming me, and we'll try to like catch if enough reports of that type come in for a given user that like, okay, they're probably doing something wrong. But it's a pretty hard problem, and I wouldn't say we have a perfect solution for it for sure. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was certainly, once we kind of get like I think a better grasp on it, we'll like certainly look. There's things that help us because we are still using the phone number, and it's part of the reason we don't like chalk it out so quickly, where you'll see people like sending from a Hong Kong phone number on Canada Telecom, and you're like, that's not that often that that happens. So you'll see patterns like that where just things stand out, where it's like, oh, like 90% of the Hong Kong numbers from this Canada Telecom are getting reported as spam. Pretty much everything in Signal is open source except for the spam filter. The spam filter itself we keep closed source because the folks who are trying to game us are also reading the source code, so we just try to keep away from what we're looking at there. But everything else is open source. The applications are open source, the server is open source. That's a great question. It pretty much rides in the same place. So within a message itself, these are the keys that are used to encrypt a message, but what a message actually contains is not strictly just text. It is a protocol buffer, and the protocol buffer can contain effectively a URL to a media file. So when you upload media on Signal or you send a message to someone that's like an image message, you will generate just a random key, encrypt the image with this random key, upload it to our media servers, and then you will include in the message to the other person the URL and the random key that you used. So we get some ciphertext block on some CDN, and the contents of this into an encrypted message are the only way that you can decrypt that block and see what the media attachment is. That's another great question. There's actually a problem that this protocol aims to solve, the simultaneous initiate, and it occurs. So this is a session establishment, but two people can actually get into this state here at the same time, where each of them have two different sessions and that are kind of half open. And the way that our library currently handles using that is we will store up to 5 of these sessions simultaneously, and the last one that you received a message on is the one we'll try to reply from. So that doesn't guarantee immediate resolution of this problem, but eventually the hope is you will have gotten a message to them from what you believe to be the current session, and they will reply on that session, and once that happens, you have got the session full open and both agree on which one's the current one. Yeah. So the question was essentially if we've seen attacks to remove all the one-time pre-keys from the server for a given user. And I wouldn't say that I've seen that in particular, but it's also hard to tell the difference between that and like some celebrity. So there are certainly people who get a lot of inbound message requests and they do exhaust that. The decreased security properties aren't all that decreased. So what happens is you're actually reusing that pre-key at the top of this exchange for starting multiple sessions. And that will get repaired by the time that the party replies anyway, because you'll mix in that Diffie-Hellman ratchet step, and the weakened security properties from that first setup will be repaired. So the advantage is not all that great. Plus, we actually rotate that last resort pre-key, I believe, once a week. So the time period that it gets reused is also like limited. Denial of service. I haven't seen a recent denial of service attempt on us. I would say the closest thing that came to a denial of service was back in January of 2021 when Elon Musk tweeted "Use Signal." We had like 20 XR user base show up in the span of about an hour. So that was pretty difficult to deal with. All right, thanks everyone.